Hello and welcome to my show. This is Rishanka Jones, and I'm back here with episode number 3. Today, I have a very special guest. Her name is Dr. Ashita Goel, and she's an anesthesiologist with almost 17 years of experience in the greater Maryland area. Welcome, Ashita.
Thank you for having me.
I know you have a very busy schedule, so thank you so much for taking some time out for me.
Absolutely.
All right, Ashita, I know you have a private practice in Maryland and it is the largest one. So in today's podcast, I want to break it down into a couple of different sections. One would be talking a little bit about anesthesia, what it is, what is your experience with your patients. And then the other side would be the business aspect. How did you start your practice? What does it take and what are the steps involved? And thirdly, we can talk about all the fun stuff, regarding what's your experiences with patients, what are the kind of things they say when they're under anesthesia, and any advice that you have for prospective anesthesiologists. How does that sound?
Sounds absolutely great.
Awesome. Ashita, before we dive into the clinical stuff, can you tell the audience a little bit about your background and how you ended up in anesthesia?
Sure. So I grew up in the Maryland area, and from the age of 5, I knew I wanted to be a doctor. And I went through and followed that, very arduous path of becoming a physician. And along the way, as I was entering my medical journey, I had an inkling for anesthesia even before I knew what it was. And medical school kind of confirmed that. So when it finally came down to it, I was left with 3 things I could possibly be, and anesthesia was at the top of the list. So that's what brought me to my specialty. After finishing medical school at the Mayo Clinic, I returned to the Maryland area to spend my first year at Georgetown, followed by 3 years of anesthesia training at Johns Hopkins University.
Wow, that's a very impressive educational background. So we now understand how and why you got into anesthesia. Can you, in simple terms, for someone like me who is an attorney who has no idea about the medical field, explain to us what is anesthesia and what does it do to the body?
Sure. So anesthesia is a set of drugs that's used to put patients in a state of sleep or some form of numbness such that they can tolerate a surgical procedure. Or we also use anesthesia for pain control. What most people think about anesthesia is they think about sleeping during surgery.
I don't know where those hearts came.
I love it. But
I'm glad they did.
Yes.
All right, please continue.
So there's different types of anesthesia that we use depending on the need. There's a purpose for why we put different patients under a state of sleep or numbness or helping treat their pain.
So you said there are different types of anesthesia. Can you talk a little bit about each type and when one is appropriate versus the other?
Right. So like right now, you see me in my scrubs. I actually helped out in the OR. I used anesthetic drugs to put multiple patients to sleep. In this case, general surgery procedures. Sorry. In one case, we removed someone's appendix. In another case, we may have removed someone's gallbladder. I was at the same time called to help out in OB, where I put epidurals in women who are trying to deliver babies. So that was medication I applied through the back, which would then make them numb from the top of their bellies down to their toes so that it would take away the pain with labor.
And you mentioned that there's local and general anesthesia?
Yeah. So general is a state of sleep.
Okay.
So whenever anyone falls asleep, even for a second, under the care of an anesthesiologist, it is termed general anesthesia. When we use the word local, we often refer to it as what the surgeon is doing. So he or she is applying local anesthetic to the field of surgery. And that's often how we describe local. We, as anesthesiologists, often do something called regional anesthesia. So instead of applying a numbing medication at the skin surface, I can actually apply numbing medication at different nerve bundles. So for example, I can make your entire arm go numb for a elbow surgery or a shoulder surgery, while the patient can be completely awake and not feel anything. So I would say that if you're categorizing things, I would say we have general anesthetics, we have regional anesthesia, we also have neuroaxial anesthesia, that's epidurals and spinals. And then we also have basically what we call MAC anesthetic, which is monitored anesthesia care, which is super light sedation, where we're mostly there to kind of just help people feel calm, but not necessarily asleep.
Ashita, what are the most common side effects that you see in patients when they take anesthesia? Or are there any at all?
There's plenty of side effects.
Okay.
But I would say that in terms of the most harmful side effects, those are things that are profound, permanent. Those occur pretty infrequently in most healthy patients and in most patients in general, for the most part. Anesthetics are, generally speaking, pretty safe. And I guess I would say that major complications are things like death, heart attacks, stroke, permanent nerve damage. So those are things that are big and bad. But minor issues are things that they occur more commonly. But in the grand scheme of life, I tell people these are things that are temporary. They're annoyances. You'll get over it. So these are things like nausea, sore throats, maybe even kind of asthma-like reactions, allergic reactions. So these are kind of things that we can help, either treat right away, prevent it, or usually they resolve with time as well.
And have you ever come across a situation where a patient had a very unusual, unexpected reaction, and how did you end up managing that?
Plenty. Most people, we have a prediction. So, for example, these are just somewhat biases, but if I see a young, strong male coming in for general anesthesia, I am going to have a inkling that they may wake up a little bit more violent just because their flight or fight response is much more aggressive when they wake up. Versus if I see a young female, I might expect more of an emotional wake up or also just even nausea. But I've seen some quite unusual wake ups because every patient is different, every surgery is different, and the combination along with the patient's risk factors create that situation. And that's why we're there to troubleshoot in a timely fashion in the moment. So a classic example is someone's on recreational drugs like PCP. The level of violence that they wake up with. I've also seen this happen with schizophrenics.
So you spoke about monitoring their behavior and keep checking on them during the procedure and after as well. Have you seen an advancement in the way things are done in an OR since when you started to now in terms of technology or patient care, quality of care?
Sure, absolutely. Since I finished residency over 17 years ago, drugs keep evolving. Our understanding of different techniques keeps changing. So we change and tailor our surgeries, our anesthetics. New procedures keep evolving as well. So we have to kind of design anesthetics that meet the needs of that particular surgery.
Is anesthesia always the only option, or are there other alternatives as well?
No, for example, there are patients sometimes who are too sick and maybe they're getting a minor procedure. So instead of needing an anesthetic, they just need reassurance. And maybe the surgeon can apply numbing medicine at the site of the procedure.
Laughing gas, the same thing? Is laughing gas anesthesia?
So it is. It's nitrous oxide.
Okay.
And I personally, in my practice, limit its use. I only use it for a little bit for pediatric cases to help kids start falling asleep, because it is odorless. And so a pediatric patient can breathe it, start getting a little bit more relaxed before I hit them with stronger anesthetics to actually make them fall asleep.
But you said you don't use it much. Why is that?
It's very nausea provoking, personal bias. So I try to limit its use in my practice.
Got it. But it does go into your bloodstream, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Similar to the anesthesia medication that you usually give.
Right. So inhaled anesthetics versus anesthetics that go in through the IV or oral anesthetics, they're all different. So inhaled anesthetics, you breathe in, but it eventually diffuses into the bloodstream and it goes into your brain to make you fall asleep.
I want to understand more about the anesthesiology practice that you have and how you got into it. So let's begin with that. What got you interested in the business side of it? And when was it?
Yeah, so in residency, I knew that I was not going to go into academics. I wanted to be an anesthesiologist in private practice. I probably knew it in medical school as well. So after finishing residency at the time in the state of Maryland, I went and evaluated a bunch of different anesthesia groups in the area. And I was given a job offer with the current company I'm with, which offered a partnership opportunity after a couple of years of being an associate. And so I went down the route. of private practice.
Okay. And what are the other business options for anesthesiologists apart from becoming a partner and starting your own anesthesia practice? Are there any other options, or these are the two ways to actually get into the business side?
So for the business side, yes, those are kind of the primary ways. The other ways, I guess, is just to be an employed anesthesiologist. So if you're an employee, you could be employed with an academic center, and separately, you could also be employed with health systems. Within those entities, you may have some business level opportunities.
Yeah.
In the sense that you may help with budgets and department overhead and kind of allocating resources. But if you're looking at business and clinical, your primary options are to join private practice or to go on your own, either as a locums, hiring yourself out individually, your services individually, or you then create your own group.
So in what year did you actually become partner in the anesthesia company?
So I became partner in 2009.
And I'm assuming it's grown a lot since then.
Yes, it's grown dramatically and astronomically. So the state of anesthesia has changed wildly, primarily in the last 5 years. We didn't actually understand what was happening until after it happened, meaning that private equity was buying up private practice. And at first, there were maybe a handful of private equity companies that were buying up clinical practices. Eventually, these private equity companies started to consolidate to the point where maybe there were only 2 to 3 players, at least in our state. And then we had this crazy thing called COVID. And between the years of 2020 and 2022, roughly, a lot of anesthesiologists left medicine for many reasons.
Okay.
And some of them retired, cut back on their hours, resulting in private equity not being able to fulfill their contracts. And basically what that resulted in was kind of almost essentially an implosion in the state of Maryland. Literally, we would have hospital systems and surgery centers that weren't able to secure anesthesia services for their facility. And that's where our group came in, basically exploded. We went from a group of about 35 to 45 people, mostly all MDs, to a flex of 150 to 200 people with a combination of anesthesiologists, CRNAs, anesthesiologists who are with our group permanently, others who are locums. So our group has expanded dramatically.
I mean, that's a fantastic growth story. It's amazing what you've achieved in Maryland. But Ashita, for those who don't understand what an anesthesiology group does, can you explain the business model a little bit? Because I know there's some difference between outpatient and patient billing, and how do these contracts work?
Sure. So we go in and offer our services to hospitals or surgery centers. As an individual, I can go and call up various surgery centers in the area and say, hey, do you need an anesthesiologist? And I can get credentialed within that surgery center. So I can go in and then do anesthesia cases. When a patient has surgery, they receive 3 bills. They receive a bill from the surgeon, they receive a bill from the facility, and then they receive a bill from the anesthesiologist. So my income is primarily based on the bill for anesthesia services. And that's how the model typically works. The same thing happens at the hospital level. However, it's very challenging for a hospital to hire only one anesthesiologist. A hospital needs a department to cover many operating rooms and endoscopy suites and labor and delivery. And so all the different parts of a hospital that require anesthesia services is beyond the scope of what one person can provide. Okay. So they typically need a group to cover their.
So do you have a yearly contract with them, like an annual contract?
It's usually about 2 years, unless any party sees that there's a problem. But usually it's a 2-year contract just because facilities need stability.
Okay. I mean, now that we're talking about billing, I want to address the elephant in the room and talk about rising healthcare costs. What do you have? When I was talking to you about, doing this podcast, you mentioned that sometimes the cost of anesthesiologists exceeds the cost of insurance reimbursement.
Correct.
How is that gap filled? And why is that happening now? Was it always like this?
No. So that's the other part. So not only did the face of the anesthesia environment change, during this COVID period and after, so did billing practices. So it's a law of supply and demand. We no longer have enough anesthesiologists and I would say CRNAs to cover the needs of all the surgery centers and hospitals in the country, especially in the state of Maryland. So we became a commodity. What used to happen was we would go into a facility and we would bill for our services, and that would be our income. But the current demand for an anesthesiologist, their rates per hour, per day, often are not fulfilled by what we bill for. There now is a gap. What before would be, if I would go into a surgery center and they would say, oh, we have 5 cases today. The day is from 8 to 2. And I would take home the pay of what the services I provided. However, now I am obligated to provide a day's pay for people who are in my practice. And so there could obviously be a gap from what we bill for and what's the going rate of the anesthesiologist, because there aren't enough. And so why would I come to your surgery center if you're only going to give me 2 or 3 hours worth of work when I go to this other place that will guarantee me this amount of work? So because of that, we now require guaranteed minimums, a minimum number of hours and a minimum of $1 per hour to cover our services. And if the billing of the case does not equate to that number, the remainder has to either come from the facility fee or from any profit. It usually comes from the facility fee, really, but theoretically any profits from the surgery too, from surgeons. There's actually been hospitals in the area where they've cut reimbursements for surgeons to pay for anesthesia service.
Wow. So the patient is not responsible to fill that gap.
No. We cannot bill more than the negotiated rates for services with insurance companies. But doesn't mean that you'll actually get an anesthesiologist for that rate.
So the business is still making money, like the anesthesia company or any other anesthesia group is still making money because the money is coming out from the facility fees or the surgeon's fees. So it is a good business to be in, which
Absolutely
is a great segue to my next question. Do you think anesthesiologists are now wanting to get into the business side more than just being like a practitioner in private practice or in a hospital?
So it begins at many levels. So first of all, let's begin with the demand to be an anesthesiologist has never been higher, like at least in like the lifetime I've known of anesthesia. And just a couple of weeks ago, actually, from the recording of this podcast, there was something called Match Day. And what Match Day is that where medical students get to find out where they get to go for their training and in what field. And for the first time I've ever heard this, only one spot in the country did not fill for an anesthesia resident, meaning that the demand is so high. And there are plenty of medical students who did not get an anesthesia spot in our country. So it is crazy because when I graduated, really what you were fighting for was a top tier spot or a second tier spot, not whether you would get a spot. So the fact that this demand is so high is kind of a testament to how much there is a demand to become an anesthesiologist. Like people want to do it. So that's kind of the beginnings. What happens in training then is a little more complicated because of restrictions in training, in hours, and kind of, I'll be honest with you, maybe I'm biased here, but generational differences. A lot of residents are not essentially being trained to go into private practice compared to when I trained. And people could argue that for other generations before me, future generations, but this is kind of what we're seeing out in the world. And that is that residents are not getting enough either skill sets where they feel comfortable right after residency to go into private practice. You look like you have a question.
I do. What are the skills needed for private practice? If you could cover that as well.
Well, I mean, you have to be able to do, anesthesia on your own. So when I go to a surgery center, I am probably the only one trained in advanced resuscitation techniques. So if there's a problem, everyone's looking at me or we're calling 911.
The education system changed since when you were in a residency versus now?
Yes. So it has changed a fair amount. Along the way, they changed the number of hours residents could work. This happened actually in the early 2000s and kind of caused creating what we call the 80-hour work week. However, with that said, anesthesia was never really affected that much by the 80-hour work week. We never worked more than 80 hours. But along the way, they made training even fewer hours than the 80 hours, much fewer. And so sometimes these residents are not getting enough of these skills and confidence and ability to do cases on their own. Also, they put in more restrictions as to kind of how much autonomy residents can have compared to when I was in training. So there's that. And then separately, there is a generational difference. I mean, come on, I'm a product of the 80s, right? Like we are the latchkey kids. Like our parents had no idea where we were for a solid 15 years. We literally like roamed the neighborhoods and we figured life out on our own. And we brought that with us to education, with our training, and it kind of reflected versus the next generation, which always had mentors and people to kind of watch over them and much more like team-based dynamics, which is great. It has its positives, but it also results in people not being confident to do things by themselves. So
how do these people function then? Are they shadowing an experienced anesthesiologist for a while and then going solo? Like, how does that work?
Well, so what ends up happening is a lot of residents go into fellowship then, right? Where they feel like they need to get more training, specialized training in different areas. A lot of residents don't feel comfortable going out alone without any mentors or supervisors in the private world. So it makes them a little bit more hesitant to do private practice or entrepreneurial endeavors versus staying with a hospital system or staying with an academic system.
And what are some of the biggest misconceptions, Ashita, that people have about the business side of anesthesiology?
So I would say that there's not much training in it. In medical school, you learn the art of medicine. In residency, you learn your specific field and the techniques and strategies you need. When were you supposed to learn the business of medicine? Everything I've learned after I finished residency and had to get out there and be part of this private practice endeavor.
So you think it's important that there should be some kind of business subject when you're in medical school?
I think it would be really helpful. In hindsight, at the time, you're so busy learning medicine and there's a slight bias because the people who are teaching you medicine are teaching you in an academic center. So they don't know the business of medicine themselves. So they live in a bubble of academics, but there's no one from the outside to teach you the business of medicine.
And those skills you learned on the job when you joined this practice, it seems like.
Correct.
Can you specify one or two of those skills that you think are very important when you're running a business in anesthesiology?
I mean, you can go
on
so many different directions, right? So, for example, when you graduate residency, how do you understand the salaries and what affects salaries in certain regions of the country? The pay scale is very different in Maryland compared to California, compared to even just New York, and there are variations in pay scale. And how do you negotiate that? And do you feel comfortable negotiating that? If you choose to go into private practice, understanding how that practice gives you your share of money. How do you earn your keep in that practice? How does the business itself earn money? Where is their revenue coming from? How does their revenue compare to other businesses? What are their negotiated rates compared to others? One thing that most people don't understand is that the rates that anesthesiologists bill are not the same. My billing rate is different than some other anesthesiologists, and even though we're in the same state. And that's based on the tax ID of the business. And so the longer your company has been in the practice of anesthesia, the bigger your business is, the higher rates you get. So if you're a solo practitioner just starting out, your rates from insurance companies are often quite low. So those are just kind of the beginning aspects of trying to understand the business side of this.
Ashita, if you were to do this again, become a partner in another company, do you think you would have changed anything with the way you made your deal with this company as a partner? Or you learned something that you would not do again?
I feel like our company itself was very fair, and really there's not much room for negotiation. And there was also a learning curve. Like our company evolved as the world around us evolved. So our company was able to adapt to change. In fact, one of the things that our company did that has led to its survival, and we're not just surviving, we're thriving, is that we never sold to private equity. So back when those groups did, we decided that we wanted to run ourselves because we didn't want anyone to tell us how to run our own company. And because of that, now we are the largest group in the state of Maryland still in private.
How do you compete with private equity? I remember you saying that private equity had started buying a bunch of these practices.
Right.
How do you compete with that? Because they are, of putting in so much money in these practices, whether it's infrastructure or marketing the company. What's your edge over that?
So initially, our group began with an exclusive contract with a hospital in the area. And our group had a very strong association with this hospital system. And as a result, we stuck by each other. The hospital system never sold the department, the contract to private equity, and we never sold to private equity either. So it was kind of that mutual respect. Because we developed these relationships, we also had a footprint in a handful of surgery centers in that vicinity. That hospital system grew, we grew with it. And then separately, we just continued to expand once private equity fell. So that's kind of how we carved out our little area. On the other side of it, I guess, is how do we hire? So our rates for hiring new grads at the time were pretty on par with like what we call kind of like the standard rate for our area. So if private equity was offering this, we were offering a comparable rate. But what we were actually offering was a ability to buy into your own practice.
Oh.
So what private equity wasn't offering, they were offering you an employed salary. And we said instead, hey, you're going to be a clinical associate. You're going to make less for the first 2 years, but then you're going to make partnership income and you can basically dictate how much salary you want. And you are going to get a voting share of this company. This is going to be your company as well. And so it was a pretty easy sell.
That is a very big motivating factor when you're
absolutely, yeah.
Because if you're being told upfront that this is an opportunity for you that may be given after 2 years, I mean, definitely one is going to take that over just a salary job.
Yes, yeah.
That's fantastic. So, Ashita, I think we talked a lot about the business of anesthesiology and the clinical side. Under the clinical side, I want to go back to that and talk a little bit about the team dynamics in the OR. I've heard it's very interesting. So, what is it like in the OR room? And is the surgeon the CEO and the anesthesiologist the COO? Like, how does it work?
Right. So it is like very interesting dynamics because in some sense you can consider any operating room like an office space, right? So this is your team. You have a surgeon, an anesthesiologist, you may have a nurse, like a CRNA, a nurse anesthesiologist or anesthetist, and you have a surgical tech. So there are a handful of players involved. But the reason why operating room dynamics are so interesting is that in no other place in medicine do you have two physicians taking care of only one patient simultaneously. And 80-90% of the time, our goals align in wanting to do the same thing for the patient. But every once in a while, a surgeon may see things differently from their point of view versus how the anesthesiologist may see things and in terms of treating the patient. So we do have those issues. And I have personally been very blessed in that I've worked in environments where people have been very collegial. Occasionally we, kind of are not as collegial, but that's pretty rare. And we usually kind of hash through a plan that would make both of us feel comfortable doing this procedure. In hindsight, residency was a little bit more hierarchical compared to my private world life. And I know from many other groups I'm involved in that it's not the same way across the country. Not everyone has these type of relationships. So what's very interesting about the operating room, it's almost kind of more like aviation, where I, as an anesthesiologist, can go into basically any operating room. And I know exactly what my role is, just like the nurse in the room can go into any other operating room and know exactly what her or his role is. And same thing with the surgeon. So we are interchangeable cogs and wheels that can go into any operating room. And mind you, the first time there might be some workflow issues, but we all know exactly what we're supposed to do anywhere you put us. So it's very unique in that sense, just kind of like a pilot and their team of, host or hostesses and all the flight crew.
There's never an argument between, say, a surgeon or an anesthesiologist. Is there someone who gets the final say in terms of process and procedure?
Well, I mean, like, there are fights. Like it's a workplace. Come on. But like, it's not physical usually. Sometimes I've heard of stories. I haven't been involved. So back in the day, there used to be this concept of the surgeon being the commander of the ship, and that has changed over time. And now it is much more of a team-based approach. And yes, when things go bad, we rely on each other. And I need the surgeon's guidance to help me understand what I have to do. And just like the surgeon needs to know what's happening to the patient, because they're focused on the surgery and controlling blood loss and fixing what's happening on the inside. And I'm monitoring the patient and taking care of what's happening for the entire whole body, for the rest of the systems. So they trust my insight and guidance to keep that patient alive so that they can do their job.
Got it. So, I mean, and this kind of goes back to what you were saying, is that everybody knows their department and you kind of just function in that department, but together.
Yes, interchangeably. Yeah, exactly.
Great.
Yeah.
And Ashita, we've talked so much about clinical stuff, business stuff. Now I want to hear some fun stories about the kind of things people say under anesthesia. Have you ever had situations where someone's woken up and started behaving like they were not that person, or they said something funny to you?
All the time. Funny things all the time. Like, I've been doing this for so long. So, like, I remember one of the patients that made me crack up is that this patient was falling asleep and she started singing the Subway jingle, like $5 Subway. You know, like, she's falling asleep. I'm like,
Oh my God.
the whole team started laughing. Like, we were just like, where did that come from?
I've had awake at this point.
Well, she was in the transition of falling asleep. I've had a patient who tried to make out with me.
My God.
Literally, like, he grabbed my head. It was bringing me in for a smooch as he was falling asleep. And thank God the surgeon was there and strong, because they were able to, get his hand off of me. Otherwise, I'd be kissing someone I did not want to be kissing.
That's never done in the OR.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And a lot of times, patients are more so they're nervous, they're scared. So, I kind of guide them, reassure them. Sometimes I'll, for example, for pediatric patients, I'll tell them jokes and, kind of make them laugh and give them some laughing gas. So they really start laughing at my jokes, my dad jokes, I call them. And for like adult patients, I often make them think of like serene environment. Sometimes I'll toss in some kind of naughty thoughts here and there, just as they're falling asleep so that they wake up a little bit more happy.
God, yeah. So, since you spoke about dad jokes, I want to go to your family a little bit.
Yeah.
So I know you have 3 boys and they're all wonderful and your husband's wonderful. How have you managed and balanced having such a busy career with being a mom, being a wife, and just juggling these 3 aspects of your life?
Wow, I was going to say, calling them wonderful is like a kind of a little overstatement here.
One flying a plane and one is in a band. It's pretty amazing, your boys.
No, they're great. So I think number one, it starts with like the husband factor. I just happened to end up with this great guy who was like the best thing ever. He is just super supportive of my career. A lot of, I would say, might have been intimidated, especially where the female is out there with these crazy hours doing this type of crazy profession. And as a guy, like now having to cook, clean, pick up kids, know, exactly what's going on the home front, more so than like, say, the wife in kind of these traditional roles. Fortunately, he works from home. But with that said, we've always had to kind of hold back his career a little bit to jobs that he can work from home, because we needed someone to be like that stable force in our family. Anesthesia is great because it is, in some ways, you can kind of dictate your hours. But at the same time, there's a lot of late nights. Your hours are never exactly predictable. Yeah.
And how have your kids handled this? Because not having mom, like I know dad's there. I see my husband also, he's available for my kids all the time, but they come running to me.
Yeah.
At the end of the day.
No, I know. It's very interesting. I have often wondered how my boys see women, because here is mom, the doctor, the breadwinner, and then there's dad who's doing all the cooking. I mean, not that he doesn't work, but he's the one who's always around.
Mhm.
And so I would say that I see my children less in a span of a week than my husband does. My presence is always felt, meaning that I'm still in charge of them. I'm still doing the household managing, hey kid, you have this test. Have you studied?
Yeah.
So I definitely am highly involved in their world.
Ashita, does it ever take a toll on your mental health? Just balancing all of this?
Yeah, of course. I mean, there are weeks where things are more overwhelming than others.
What do you do to manage that?
When things get really stressful, sometimes you have to kind of let it pass and take one element at a time. But sometimes when it's that stressful, it's because I don't have time. And then that's when you're kind of there for your partner, make sure you get adequate sleep, and realizing that this too will pass.
Yeah, that's great advice, Ashita. And I met you this last week, and then you suggested 2 books. It would be great if you could let the audience also know about those books and some advice for prospective anesthesiologists who are maybe thinking of getting into the business world of anesthesiology. That would be amazing.
Right. So yeah. So oddly enough, it's a great segue to the books that we were talking about. And so one of the books I mentioned was this book called Grit. So it's Grit. And I love this book because it's a parenting guide in terms of kind of exposing your kids to what I call extracurricular activities and how to make successful kids. And it kind of goes in part with a little mini TED talk I give my kids all the time. And then we talk about that there are 3 parts to achieve success in this life, right? So it's opportunity, talent, or intelligence, as I call it, and the other being motivation. And you need all 3 to be successful. So for example, if you're born in a war-torn country, it's really hard to be successful just because of sheer opportunity, right? And of those 3 things that you need to be successful, motivation or grit has twice as much weight as the other 2. So you can kind of almost overcome less talent or less intelligence by your sheer motivation level. And same thing with opportunity. So for that person born in a war-torn country, because you lack that opportunity, if you have that motivation to somehow get to whatever you need, you're able to do it. So that's what that book kind of touches on, and it went in line with what I try to teach my kids as well.
Yeah, I'm excited.
I know, right? I thought it was great. And then the other one being, the author's name is Voss, Voss, and it was Never Split the Difference. It's the art of negotiation. But it's not just about negotiating the price of a car, but just how to negotiate through life. And the author is a former FBI hostage negotiator. And he talks about tactics and tools you can have to kind of help you negotiate through life's challenges. And in this case, negotiate through job markets and insurance companies. Yeah.
Awesome. And Ashita, any kind of advice, suggestions, resources that you would recommend to prospective anesthesiologists?
I would say one thing that I would recommend to prospective anesthesiologists, if they're in training, to get themselves at a level where they feel comfortable doing skills on their own. Try to make it so that they can practice independently and comfortably, because that's what the world is outside once you leave training. In terms of understanding the business of anesthesia, Anesthesia Society puts on practice management conferences, and I kind of wish I had gone to them more often and earlier than I had. And so I think it kind of really teaches you some of the business aspects of anesthesia, especially once you leave residency.
Ashita, can you think of anything else that I may have not covered and you feel like it would be beneficial for the audience to know in this anesthesiology world?
I mean, I think one of the greatest things to have in this world of anesthesia is being adaptable, whether it's your skill sets as an anesthesiologist, your skill sets as a parent. I think the easier it's going to be to navigate through life and this career.
Wow, that's great advice. I think flexibility is the key to surviving in today's world.
Absolutely.
Ashita, this was so good. And I know you're on few hours of sleep and you were very kind to come on the podcast and talk for an hour. I really appreciate that. So thank you so
welcome.
much.
Yeah.
And Ashita, is it okay if I put your email address and the link to your website at the bottom of the video in case someone wants to reach out to you for mentorship or just help?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you so much. This was Rishanka Jones, and we had a great session with Dr. Goel. If you have any questions regarding anesthesiology, please reach out to her. Her website and her email will be linked at the bottom. If you like the video, please like, subscribe, and share. This is Rishanka Jones signing off.